When people today think of the Middle Ages, one of the first images that comes to mind is the castle. Stone towers rising from misty hills, surrounded by high walls, moats, and banners fluttering in the wind. But for most of the medieval period, especially in the early centuries, castles weren't a common part of life at all. They didn't dominate the countryside the way we imagine. And for the people who lived near them, or inside them, castles weren't magical or glamorous. They were just part of the landscape. Sometimes helpful. Often uncomfortable. Frequently boring. Before the rise of castles, Europe had already gone through many layers of history. The Roman Empire had spread roads, cities, baths, and stone buildings across the continent. But after Rome fell, much of that infrastructure crumbled. People lived in wooden huts. Villages were small and scattered. Power was localized, and large-scale building projects were rare. There was little need, or ability, to build something as massive as a castle. The earliest forms of fortification after the fall of Rome weren't castles at all. They were simple hill forts, wooden palisades, and old Roman ruins reused in new ways. People built what they needed from the materials they had. And most of the time, that didn't include stone towers. It wasn't until the 9th and 10th centuries, as Viking raids and local conflicts became more common, that the need for better defense grew. Lords began to establish private strongholds, early castles that were more about control than comfort. These weren't luxurious fortresses. They were functional, often cold, and constantly under repair. One of the earliest and most common types of medieval castles was the motte and bailey design. This was a wooden tower, or keep, built on a mound of earth called a motte, with a fenced courtyard, or bailey, below. The whole structure might be surrounded by a ditch or moat. These castles could be built quickly and provided a clear symbol of power. But they weren't built to last. The wood rotted. Fires were a constant risk. And life inside was far from grand. Even as castles evolved into larger stone structures, they remained uncomfortable places to live. There was no central heating. Rooms were dark, damp, and smoky. Windows were small to keep out arrows and cold wind. Walls were thick but offered little insulation. Privacy was rare. Furniture was simple. Beds were shared. Servants, guards, animals, and family members all lived in close quarters. Castles also didn't smell very good. Hygiene in the medieval world was not a top priority. Toilets, called garderobes, were small stone rooms that emptied into the moat, or sometimes just down the side of the wall. Moats weren't filled with clean water. They often became stagnant pits of waste and runoff. The kitchens were large but chaotic. Fires burned constantly. Meat spoiled easily. Rats were everywhere. There were no refrigerators, and food storage was a constant challenge. Spices, when available, were used not just for flavor but to cover the taste of meat that had gone bad. Despite the discomfort, castles served a purpose. They provided defense in uncertain times. A well-placed castle could control a road, a river crossing, or a border. They became symbols of authority, both real and imagined. To see a castle on a hill was to know who was in charge. But for most of the people living in a castle's shadow, life didn't change much. They still farmed the land, paid taxes, and obeyed their lords. The presence of a castle didn't guarantee protection. In times of war, peasants might be allowed inside the outer walls, but not always. And when a castle was under siege, the surrounding villages often suffered the most. Sieges were not heroic battles. They were long, slow, and miserable affairs. Armies surrounded a castle, cut off supplies, and waited. Inside, food ran low. Water grew dirty. Disease spread. People were trapped. There was little to do but wait and hope the attackers gave up. Sometimes they did. Often, they didn't. Castles weren't invincible. Siege weapons grew more advanced. Trebuchets could hurl stones and fire over the walls. Miners dug tunnels beneath foundations. Eventually, gunpowder and cannons made thick stone walls less useful. Even in times of peace, life in a castle was repetitive. Lords held court, collected taxes, and dealt with disputes. Ladies managed the household, oversaw servants, and handled food stores. Children were educated, or not, depending on their station. Guards trained. Servants worked. Meals were eaten. Fires were lit. And then, the day ended. There were events, of course. Feasts. Weddings. Visits from neighboring nobles. But these were occasional. Most days passed quietly. There was little outside entertainment. Books were rare. Music was limited. Art was minimal. Castles were not centers of culture. They were strongholds of routine. The view from a castle window may have looked majestic, but the reality was often dull. Daily life was shaped by the seasons, the harvest, and the endless work of survival. Castles were big, but they weren't exciting. Part 2: Life inside the castle walls. Living inside a medieval castle did not mean luxury. For most people, noble or servant, it meant hard work, repetition, and limited comfort. Though castles offered safety, they rarely offered peace. The lord of the castle was responsible for managing the surrounding lands. He was both a military leader and a landlord. Each morning, the day began early. The lord met with advisors and stewards. Decisions had to be made about crops, taxes, tenants, and disputes. People brought problems. A missing ox. A collapsed wall. A stolen chicken. The lord, or one of his officials, would hear each case and pass judgment. It was more like a manager's routine than a king's. The lady of the castle also worked. She supervised the domestic staff, managed the food stores, oversaw spinning, weaving, and the care of children. She was expected to know the inventory of every room, every barrel of grain, every bolt of cloth. There were no vacations. No free weekends. Just tasks, lists, and responsibilities. Children of noble families were often raised inside the castle. Their lives were structured around learning the roles they were expected to fill. Boys trained in combat, etiquette, and language. Girls learned sewing, household management, and reading, if they were lucky. Childhood was short. By age 12 or 14, most were engaged or serving as pages or handmaidens in other noble households. Meals inside a castle followed a routine. Breakfast was light, often just bread and ale. Midday meals were heavier and served in the Great Hall. This was the largest room in the castle, but not necessarily the most comfortable. It was cold, smoky, and noisy. The fire burned in the center or in a stone hearth along the wall. Light came from narrow windows or flickering torches. There were no forks. Food was eaten with fingers, knives, and stale bread used as plates. Dinner was served in the late afternoon. It was quieter, especially in winter when darkness fell early. After dinner, the castle grew still. Without electricity or lanterns, people relied on candles and small oil lamps. Most stayed near the fire, wrapped in cloaks or furs. Reading was rare. Books were few. Most people ended their day not with entertainment, but with sleep. The servants who worked in the castle lived hard lives. They rose before the nobles and went to bed after them. There were kitchen maids, laundresses, stable hands, cooks, guards, messengers, and scullions. They carried water, chopped wood, scrubbed floors, and cleaned chamber pots. Most had little personal space. They slept in shared rooms or hallways, sometimes even in the kitchens. They had few possessions and even fewer choices. The castle kitchen was the busiest room. Fires burned all day. Meat was roasted on spits. Bread was baked in ovens. Large pots simmered with stew. Dishes were washed in cold water. Rats and flies were constant. Servants moved quickly, carrying trays, fetching ingredients, and avoiding burns. Guards patrolled the walls and watched the gates. Their job was not always thrilling. Hours passed with no sign of danger. They stood in the wind and rain, listened for distant hooves or shouted warnings. Training drills were held regularly, but actual combat was rare. Many guards never saw a battle. Artisans also lived in or near the castle. Blacksmiths made weapons, tools, and horseshoes. Carpenters repaired stairs and roofs. Masons worked on walls and towers. Tailors and cobblers made clothes and shoes. Most of this work happened quietly, in workshops tucked into corners of the outer yard or bailey. Entertainment, when it happened, was simple. A traveling minstrel might arrive with a lute. A juggler might perform in the great hall. There were stories, songs, and jokes. But these events were not daily. They were special. Most evenings were silent. Holidays brought a break in routine. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were marked with extra food, church services, and sometimes dancing. But even these moments were surrounded by chores. Animals still needed feeding. Fires still needed tending. And most people, including nobles, still worked. Cleanliness was not a strong point. Baths were taken infrequently. Water had to be heated by hand. Lice and fleas were common. Clothes were worn until they were dirty, then brushed or aired out. Full washing was rare. Toilets were basic. Some castles had small stone rooms that emptied into moats or pits. These were called garderobes. They were cold, drafty, and unpleasant. Servants cleaned them, though not often enough. Smells lingered. And there was no toilet paper, just moss, straw, or scraps of cloth. Castles were also noisy in their own way. Hammers rang in the smithy. Dogs barked. Chickens clucked. The drawbridge creaked. People shouted orders, chopped wood, or sang work songs. But at night, the noise faded. Only the wind remained, pushing softly through cracks in the stone. In winter, life became harder. The stone walls held the cold. Fires helped, but only in the central rooms. People wore layers of wool, fur, and linen. Feet were wrapped in rags. Doors were sealed with cloth. Water froze in buckets. Travel became dangerous. Supplies ran low. Snow made everything harder. In summer, heat gathered in the towers. Flies invaded the kitchens. The moat smelled worse. Illness spread faster. Food spoiled quickly. People drank more ale than water, because it was safer. For all their size and strength, castles were vulnerable. Fires, storms, and enemy attacks could destroy years of work. Repairs were constant. Roofs leaked. Stones cracked. Wood rotted. Maintaining a castle took money, time, and effort. Most castles were not filled with treasure. Gold and jewels were rare. Walls were plain. Tapestries and rugs, when used, helped block wind and trap warmth. Weapons hung on walls, but mostly for show. Real fighting was uncommon. In fact, many castles changed hands peacefully. A siege might end in surrender. A marriage might transfer ownership. A lord might be called away to war and never return. The castle stayed, but its people came and went. And even when life inside a castle was peaceful, it wasn't glamorous. There were no grand balls. No shining armor on display. No magic. Just routines, chores, and stone. Children played in the yards. Women spun wool. Men sharpened blades. Fires crackled. Chickens scratched in the dirt. That was castle life. No one thought it was exciting. Most people dreamed of comfort, not adventure. A warm meal. A dry bed. A quiet night. Castles provided safety, but not much else. They were homes, but also prisons. They were symbols of power, but also reminders of limits. And above all, they were places of repetition. Each day, the same. Wake. Work. Eat. Sleep. No wonder the people who lived there rarely wrote about excitement. They were too busy living in stone halls that echoed more with chores than with legends. Part 3. Castles were about control, not comfort. Though castles today appear in movies, books, and fairy tales as majestic landmarks or homes of brave heroes, their true purpose was never beauty or inspiration. In their time, castles stood as symbols of control, stone reminders of who ruled the land, and who did not. The location of a castle was rarely accidental. It was placed where it could dominate a road, a bridge, a river crossing, or a valley. From the highest tower, a lord could watch over fields, forests, and villages. But the watching wasn't peaceful. It was strategic. Castles were placed to control trade routes, collect tolls, or block enemy movement. They were not open to the public. They were not centers of community life. They were centers of power. For villagers living nearby, a castle was both protection and pressure. During raids or wars, peasants might be allowed behind the walls for safety, but only temporarily. Most of the time, the castle loomed above them as a constant presence, its walls a physical barrier and its lord an absolute authority. Feudalism was the order of the time. Lords owned the land. Peasants worked the land. Castles made that order visible. They weren't just places to live. They were reminders of ownership. To look at a castle was to see your place in the world. The castle gates could be opened, or closed, at a moment's notice. Travelers might be stopped, searched, or turned away. Trade could be taxed. Roads could be blocked. Castles gave their owners control over movement as well as territory. Inside the castle, the lord exercised legal power. Courts were held in the Great Hall. Disputes were settled. Punishments were handed out. And those who disagreed had few choices. There was no appeal. The castle was law. In this way, castles enforced silence. They didn't just protect. They suppressed. Not through violence alone, but through presence. Their height, their walls, their towers, all served to say, this land is taken. These people are ruled. Castles also served military functions, of course. Armories were stocked. Barracks were built. Walls were patrolled. But battles were rare. Most of a castle's life was spent waiting. Maintaining readiness. Preparing for something that might never come. That meant the castle also became a workplace. There were guards, cooks, blacksmiths, scribes, stewards, and messengers. Each role had duties. And most days, those duties were repetitive. A guard's shift might involve walking the same stretch of wall over and over. A steward might check the same lists every day. A blacksmith might hammer out the same shape, again and again. Castles required upkeep. Rain damaged roofs. Wind cracked windows. Mice gnawed at food stores. Stone eroded. Wood rotted. People didn't admire castles for their style. They inspected them for leaks, drafts, and infestations. Traveling to a castle was no easy task, either. Roads were rough. Horses needed care. Weather was unpredictable. For many, a castle remained a distant place, seen only from the fields or glimpsed on a journey. There were no public tours. No festivals inside the gates. Unless summoned, most people never entered. And yet, the castle watched. Always above. Always present. For nearby towns and villages, the castle's presence affected everything. It shaped trade. It changed where people could walk. It shifted power. And it reminded people that their lives were not fully their own. Taxes were collected at the castle. Tithes were sent to it. Grain was stored in its barns. Soldiers trained in its yards. And rumors flowed from its gates, rumors of war, peace, famine, or royal visits. Because castles were political tools as well. A visit from the king could elevate a castle's importance, or threaten its lord's position. Alliances formed and broke. Marriages were arranged. Letters were sealed. All behind stone walls. And when castles fell out of favor, when wars moved elsewhere, or the king's attention shifted, they did not become peaceful havens. They became targets. Weak points. Or worse, prisons. Many castles held dungeons. These were not elaborate underground labyrinths, but simple dark rooms, often windowless and damp. They served their purpose. Not to torture, but to isolate. To remove someone from the world. No one escaped. Not because of chains, but because of walls. The power of a castle was not its weapons. It was its permanence. It did not need to act to control. Its very presence did that work. And over time, people learned to live with that shadow. They stopped questioning it. They built their lives around it. This didn't mean everyone lived in fear. Most people lived in habit. The castle became part of the landscape, like the forest or the river. Something accepted. Something old. Something unchanging. Children grew up pointing at its towers. Farmers timed their planting by the movement of guards. Traders adjusted their routes to avoid tolls. And inside, the Lord counted grain, planned marriages, and oversaw walls that rarely changed. Even rebellion was rare. To challenge a castle meant challenging stone, soldiers, and systems. And most people lacked the tools, or the will, to try. It was easier to adjust. To live under, rather than against. That's why castles lasted. Not because they were invincible, but because they became normal. Their control was quiet. Their power was routine. And for that reason, they weren't exciting. They didn't surprise. They didn't inspire. They instructed. They reminded. They watched. And as time passed, they weathered. Stones cracked. Walls shifted. Roofs fell. But the idea of the castle, the symbol of who holds power, remained. Today, we visit castles as tourists. We take photos, admire the view, imagine knights and kings. But in their time, castles weren't dreams. They were realities. Heavy, cold, constant. People didn't daydream about them. They worked around them. They feared them. They depended on them. And mostly, they ignored them. Because the real story of a castle is not its battles or its towers. It's the silence beneath the stone. The weight of rules. The passage of time. The slow grinding of power, visible in mortar and moss. Part 4, the slow decline of castles. Like the people who built them, castles aged. Time wore down their purpose. What was once necessary became less useful. What was once feared became ordinary. And eventually, castles stopped being the center of power they had once been. The decline didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, over centuries. And at first, it wasn't even noticed. New ideas began to spread across Europe in the late Middle Ages. Trade increased. Towns grew. Roads improved. People moved more freely. Knowledge spread faster. And the world became slightly less isolated. Castles, once built to control space, suddenly found themselves in a world that was expanding. As cities rose, the power of individual lords declined. Kings grew stronger. Parliaments began to form. Laws were written down. Power was no longer only about land, it became about money, influence, and alliances. And with that, castles became less central. The invention of gunpowder was a turning point. Stone walls, no matter how thick, couldn't withstand cannon fire. A single well-aimed shot could destroy parts of a castle that had taken decades to build. Siege warfare changed. Suddenly, a castle could be brought down in days instead of years. Lords began to realize that defense through walls was no longer practical. Instead, they relied more on armies, politics, and wealth. The age of towering fortresses slowly gave way to the age of fortified cities and professional militaries. This shift changed the function of castles. Some were converted into manor houses, homes that looked like castles but lacked defenses. Others were abandoned. No longer practical. No longer strategic. Just expensive old buildings made of cold stone. Many castles fell into disrepair. Roofs caved in. Towers crumbled. Moats dried up. Ivy crept over walls. Locals took stones for their homes. Gates rusted. Wooden doors collapsed. Nature moved back in. Birds nested in high windows. Moss covered staircases. Trees grew in courtyards. What was once feared became forgotten. Some castles were repurposed. Turned into prisons, granaries, or administrative buildings. But even then, their days were numbered. More modern buildings were easier to maintain. And castles, with their uneven floors and drafty halls, weren't suited to new needs. For many centuries, there were no efforts to preserve castles. They were not yet considered valuable as heritage. They were seen as outdated structures, symbols of feudal power that no longer fit the times. Still, some castles remained lived in. Nobles with long family histories kept their ancestral homes, even if only parts of them were habitable. Rooms were sealed off. Fireplaces were rebuilt. But maintenance was costly. And the grandeur faded. In some cases, kings or rulers deliberately destroyed castles. This was called slighting, the act of making a castle unusable, often after a rebellion. Walls were torn down. Keeps were blown up. Gates were blocked with rubble. It was a way to ensure that no future uprising could take shelter there. Over time, the castle became less a symbol of control and more a symbol of the past. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Romantic period, interest in castles returned, but not as homes or fortresses. Now, they were seen as ruins. As poetic reminders of lost eras. Painters, writers, and poets visited them not to admire their strength, but to reflect on their decay. Castles became scenery. Silent. Majestic in ruin. Slowly turning into tourist destinations, not power centers. Some were partially restored. Paths were cleared. Roofs repaired. Tours arranged. But their role had changed forever. They were no longer centers of authority. They were part of memory. Historical rather than functional. The towns that once served them grew larger, more independent. Governments moved to cities. Armies changed their strategies. Technology advanced. And castles, once cutting edge, became quaint. Still, they didn't vanish. Their stones remained. Even crumbling walls stood tall against the wind. Visitors walked through empty halls and wondered what life must have been like when they were full. But the answer, more often than not, was simple, repetitive, and difficult. The romance of castles came later. Stories were written. Myths created. Legends of knights, dragons, and kings filled books and songs. But these were not the stories told by the people who lived there. Their stories were quieter. They spoke of cold mornings, hard labor, silent meals, and long winters. Even today, many castles sit quietly in the countryside. Some are surrounded by modern homes. Others are isolated on cliffs or hills. Most are quiet. They are visited, photographed, and admired. But they are no longer feared. And few people would choose to live in one again. Because castles were not comfortable. They were not efficient. They were not modern. They were tools. Instruments of power, built from stone and sweat. Meant to last, but not meant to evolve. And that is why they faded. Not because they failed. But because the world moved on. And castles, for all their strength, could not keep up. In this way, they remain. Stubborn. Weathered. Beautiful in their way. But behind their walls lies a history of repetition, control, and cold floors. Not excitement. Not glory. Just life. Layered in stone. Forgotten by time. Remembered by shape. Part 5, When Castles Became Fantasy. Long after their walls had crumbled, castles began a second life, not as homes or strongholds, but as dreams. Over time, stories were told. Paintings were made. Films were shot. And the world remembered castles not as they were, but as we wanted them to be. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, over generations. And it began not with those who built castles, but with those who had never lived in them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, artists, writers, and poets started to look at ruined castles as romantic symbols. They weren't interested in the daily chores, cold stone, or lack of privacy. They saw castles as mysterious places, filled with secrets, faded banners, and lost love. This was the beginning of the castle myth. Painters drew towers bathed in moonlight. Writers imagined knights in armor rescuing princesses. Poets wrote of lonely castles on cliffs. The truth of these buildings, gray walls, cramped rooms, smoke-stained ceilings, was replaced with imagination. This was the age of Gothic novels. Castles became settings for ghost stories and dark romances. They were haunted. Enchanted. Magical. And always more exciting than the real thing. The trend continued. By the 20th century, castles were appearing in fairy tales, films, and children's books. The humble wooden palisade or stone keep became a glittering fortress with turrets and towers. Royal families were no longer concerned with collecting taxes or managing grain, they were noble, generous, and wise. The castle, as an idea, had changed. Hollywood embraced the fantasy. Movies set in the Middle Ages showed clean, bright interiors, shining armor, dramatic battles, and noble quests. The peasants were cheerful. The heroes were brave. The castles were spotless. Video games, cartoons, and theme parks followed. Castles became symbols of magic, of power, of childhood wonder. But real castles were never like that. They weren't built to inspire awe. They were built to control land, to store supplies, to guard trade routes. Their floors were uneven, their staircases narrow, their ceilings low, their purpose simple. Still, the fantasy lived on. Because it was easier to dream of a castle than to live in one. Even modern buildings began to mimic castle shapes. Decorative towers, arched gates, stone veneers. But they had central heating, plumbing, and lighting. The appearance of a castle, but not the discomfort. People visited real castles expecting drama. What they often found was silence. Empty rooms, worn steps, echoing halls. A sense of history, but not excitement. And yet, that silence is its own kind of power. Castles don't need to entertain. They only need to remain. That is perhaps what makes them memorable. Their ability to last, even as memory changes their meaning. In reality, castles were places of work, of routine, of control. But they have become, in memory, places of adventure, of beauty, of drama. This isn't wrong. Memory is flexible. Stories grow with time. And if a child walks through a ruined castle and imagines dragons, that is a kind of magic too. Still, it helps to remember what castles truly were. Not only for the history, but for the people who lived within them. They did not wake to glorious sunrises from high towers. They woke in drafty rooms, to the smell of smoke and animals. They did not dine at feasts every night. They ate bread and stew in noisy halls. They did not ride into battle in shining armor. Most lived their lives within the same walls, working, waiting, enduring. Their stories matter. Not because they are exciting, but because they are real. Today, castles are quiet. Visitors walk their grounds. Cameras click. Tour guides speak. But behind the noise is a deep silence. A stillness. That is the castle's true gift. A pause in time. A window into lives once lived. No drama. No special effects. Just stone, wind, and memory. Part 6, Stone, Silence, and Sleep. And so, we return one final time to the quiet shadow of the medieval castle. It may stand on a hill, or in a field, or beside a crumbling riverbank. Its towers may still be tall. Or maybe only one wall remains, half covered in moss and age. But the castle endures. Not in the way it once did, as a center of command or a symbol of control, but in a softer, quieter way. As a memory held in stone. To visit a castle today is to walk backward through time. To feel cold walls and uneven steps. To look through narrow windows at a world that has long moved on. And perhaps, for a moment, to understand that history is not made only of battles and crowns, but of stillness, of routine, of waiting. Inside those walls, thousands of lives passed without being recorded. A servant brushing straw from the floors. A child learning to read by candlelight. A guard squinting into the fog. A cook stirring stew, again and again, each morning and night. These are the moments that truly filled the castle. They were not thrilling. But they were real. Life in a castle was not like a story. It was not a grand tale with clear heroes and villains. It was a slow rhythm. Chores. Meals. Weather. Silence. And sleep. The stone remembered everything. The footsteps. The laughter. The quiet sobs in the early hours. The wind pushing against the shutters. The embers dying in the hearth. And the same voices repeating the same tasks, day after day, season after season. Some castles heard moments of joy. A marriage. A birth. A feast. But even these passed quickly. And life returned to normal. A castle was, in many ways, a machine of monotony. Built to last. Built to repeat. And it is in that repetition that its truth lies. Castles did not change fast. Nor did the people inside them. Days blurred. Years passed. And still, the fires needed tending. The walls needed patching. The bread needed baking. For all their grandeur from a distance, up close, castles were homes of hard living. They protected, but they also confined. They impressed, but they also isolated. And for most, they simply existed. Perhaps this is why they are so quiet now. Why visitors lower their voices as they walk the empty halls. Why children look up in wide-eyed wonder. Why artists keep sketching them. And why storytellers continue to invent new legends in their shadows. There is something soothing in their silence. Something steady. Something deeply still. In a world that moves fast, a castle does not. It waits. It endures. It listens. And if you find yourself near one, whether in person or in thought, remember that it has no need to speak loudly. Its story is already there. In its stones. In its echoes. In the wind that moves through its empty rooms. Not every story needs a battle. Not every memory needs drama. Sometimes, the most powerful tales are the quiet ones. A castle, at its core, was a place of human life. Not magic. Not fantasy. Just people, doing what they needed to survive. Sometimes with dignity. Sometimes with difficulty. Always with repetition. And as you rest now, with these thoughts in your mind, imagine those slow footsteps across cold stone. The distant sound of a drawbridge chain. The flicker of torchlight on gray walls. The soft rustling of linen sheets. The wind pushing through cracks in the tower. Let the repetition lull you. Let the silence settle. Because boring history isn't truly boring. It's simply gentle. Honest. And quiet. Just like a castle. And just like this moment. Sleep well.